Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwyn. I'm Oliver Gwyn, and this is where we talk about marketing, data, and philosophy. This week we are talking about Hegel's Dialectic, which, yes, does sound like a Pokemon, and decision making. Now, Hegel is an interesting person to start applying to business because he was a little bit anti-capitalism. Not that capitalism quite existed at his time. He was around in sort of the Napoleonic War era. So capitalism hasn't quite come about yet, but suddenly you've got the Industrial Revolution in England, which he saw, and he was very opposed to the idea of companies and organizations putting other companies out of business without thinking about what would you do with all the unemployed people. He described that as being quite brutal. So he wasn't anti-capitalist, but he's certainly somebody who was not fond of the business world and spent most of his life as a lecturer and teacher and eventually became head of philosophy in Berlin University. Where is he on the time scale of philosophy? So he's inspired by Kant, careful how you say that one, kids, and Goethe, Spinoza, and then he goes on to inspire people like Derrida and Marx, and you can argue that there's no Marx without Hegel. What is he famous for? Well, he's famous for, and perhaps this is the first lesson we shall learn today, being very inaccessible. He writes in a very mysterious way that is very hard to understand. His work is very, very complicated. And in fact, famously, upon his death, he said his last words were, "There was only one man who understood me, and even he did not understand me." So I'm not sure that that's something he should have been so proud of. I think that if you are somebody with big ideas like Hegel certainly have, you should try and make them as accessible as possible. And perhaps his best works, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about him, don't actually go and read his books. Go and read his encyclopedias, which he prepared for his students and are a little bit more easy to understand and accessible. And sometimes his prefaces and notes and outlines are the best thing to try and understand him. An interesting side story before we get into it about his strange relationship. So Hegel had an illegitimate son that he named after his older brother, and he also has a seemingly incestuous relationship with his sister Christiana, who, upon him getting married at age 40, becomes completely hysterical, is actually locked away in an asylum for 1 year because, of course, back then women weren't allowed to have emotions. And then upon his death, 3 months later, after she's left the asylum, she drowns herself. So very strong relationship with her brother there, quite unusual. Now, the part of his philosophy that I'm going to concentrate on today is this idea that Hegel had that progress is never linear. Hegel was a huge historian. He's really interested in history, and he's really interested particularly in the Roman era of history and Plato and Socrates and all these kind of people. But he had this theory that progress is never linear, and typically it goes through a three-phase sort of act, which is the dialectic that I was mentioning, of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, although he didn't actually use those terms to describe it. So his example would be, for example, Athens was very free. They let everybody do what they wanted. All men had free spirit, and maybe that was too far one way, and so they get conquered and overtaken by the Spartans, who were race of warriors, very much a tight caste system there, and maybe that was too lack of freedom, and then eventually the Romans have sort of the right balance between the two of those ideals. And he cited throughout history that this had happened time and time again, and wherever you have a strong leaning to the right or left, you normally have a correction, and in the middle you'll find the right sort of politics and ideas. He also believed very strongly that there's always value in opposing views, no matter how much you might disagree with them. There's always something true and meaningful there, and you shouldn't disregard them altogether. And I think those two sort of lessons of looking at history and realizing that there are valid ideas back in history that we can still apply to our modern day lives today, and respecting that ideas will eventually lurch from one side to the other, is really important to us in today's society, where it seems very polarizing, our ideas, especially along political lines, depending which country you are in. But I'm sure that we can all apply this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis to business as well, and business decisions. Isn't it so true that when one thing happens to us, maybe we hire somebody who seems to be great, and then it turns out that they're absolutely useless, and so we go one way to other. We don't trust people again. We do too much in our hiring process. We put in extra steps to make sure that everybody is 100% right. We go too far the other way. And then it turns out that we start not getting the right talent for our business because the interview process is too long and the right people just can't be bothered to go through that process. And so eventually we head to a middle ground, right? I'm sure we can all recognize in our lives that that's the action that we take, especially when bad things or good things happen to us. When good things happen to us, we assume that maybe they'll happen again. We're very open to that happening again, and maybe we're a little bit too open. And so we go the other way, where maybe then something bad happens to us and we close off ourselves, and eventually we come to a nice middle point on things. And how would that apply when we start thinking about data? You're probably thinking, well, Oliver, you're a data person. Are you going to tell me that these 3 steps, this lurching, this progress of not being linear, doesn't matter anymore? That data kind of solves this for us because we have the answers quicker and easier and more accessible than ever before. And interestingly, my thought is that in a weird way, data can block progress. Because now the feedback loop has got shorter and shorter and shorter. In fact, we can begin to predict the outcome of things with a high degree of accuracy if we've got the data. From day one, for example, on advertising campaigns, we worked on a client's project. We put in a prediction on ROI on advertising campaigns. It was 80% successful on day one. And of course, over time, got more and more successful. And so very, very quickly, we can tell if something's going to work. And you would think that would be a good thing. You would think that would mean that we are not spending a load of money, thesis on an advertising campaign, realizing it doesn't work, then antithesis, not spending any money the next time, and then synthesis, spending a moderate amount of money and just honing our ideas as we go along. You would think that data throughout that journey would help you on those decision making, but actually I think the opposite can be true. I think sometimes in life, things don't always work straight away. Things don't always work within the first couple of weeks. I think there's plenty of use cases that we can think of where somebody was working for a long period of time on something, they were very consistent in what they did, and eventually it worked overnight. Now, of course, that's only possible if you've got the funds to be able to believe in yourself and to carry that out. And of course, things should never go on and on while they're losing money. But I'm sure we can all think of popular shows and bands, things in popular culture where they were not very popular for a long time, and then suddenly they became the right thing. The cultural moment around them happened, and all of their past work came to light, and suddenly we liked them because of that. And I think that's very true. I think very rare is it that things work from day one, and sometimes data can be misleading. If you write a blog or a newsletter like I did in week 1, probably I had 50 people signed up, and that's not reflective of the overall growth of something, because things do grow over time and it takes time and consistency in order to do that. And so data, while it might be able to point out the strong indication of what's going to happen, and maybe it can guide that thesis and synthesis and antithesis sort of process a little bit quicker, we can not lose money while we make those business decisions. We cannot keep something losing money over a long period of time. I think in some ways it's dangerous, because what can happen is that you get a strong reaction back, you make a decision based on it straight away, and sometimes maybe the decision is wiser to think, let's leave things a little bit longer. Of course, I'm a strong believer in trying things in a small way and then building from there, in A/B testing everything that you're doing in terms of messaging, and in trying to prove something is successful before you even go into the public and make a decision based on small things. So you're not having to go from one to the other, basically. I think it's also true that people are sometimes guilty of doing the opposite. So they are definitely guilty of leaving things running, especially where work has gone into like a marketing campaign or a process has been established and it's been very painful to put into your team, where they just leave it going and they've spent time on it and they give it too much of a chance, and the numbers and the feedback are there telling you that it's not the right thing to do and you should change quickly. And I know it's a little bit conflicting to say sometimes you need to leave things a little bit longer and see how they go, and sometimes you need to chop and change more quickly. How do you inform that decision? How do you make sure you're not lurching from one side to the other too drastically? Well, I think money is probably the key aspect, where you're spending budget, where you're burning cash. That's always a key deciding figure in any decisions you're making. You also have to think about how closely it aligns to your core goals. If you are running an ad campaign, as that's the example I've been going with, and it's not working well, if it still ties to your core goals and you still believe that the messaging is right, maybe you just need a different ad platform or a different ad format, or maybe you just need to tinker with it a little bit so you can make a small change without changing your overall decision there, without having to lurch too much from one to the other. And so when we're thinking about decisions and we're thinking about how do we progress, I guess the three thoughts from Hegel are: one is look at history. History is a great teacher, not just your company history and the way that you've done things before, where maybe you've been burnt and you've made too strong a decision one way or another, but other companies and other use cases that you've seen in the public domain are a great place to learn from. Even if they're not modern, even if they're not current, there's still a lot that we can learn from other companies and other businesses and history in general. Two, always try and think about not just the business decision, the logical decision, the data that you're getting. Factor in the emotional decision, factor in the historical reasons why you might make a particular decision. A lot of the time, stakeholders are guilty of holding past mistakes or past successes close to heart because it's something that they've done, they've got the experience, especially if they've done something 2-3 times before. But where you may have some recency bias, where you have a particular use case that was really, really good for you and it went really well, you're more likely to say, well, we're going to keep doing this because it worked for me in the past. And so evaluate how objective your opinion is, where can data feed into that, and try and prevent that. If you are going to go through a period of progress of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, that you're doing it as quickly as possible and you're coming to that midpoint with minimal spend and minimal disruption to your business. So those are my very quick thoughts this week on how Hegel's dialectic might approach to business making decisions and how data feeds into that. Hope you found this interesting, and tune in next week for some more thoughts.